talk about SWAT CAM. This is a new product for us coming out here in 2023, and it's all about eliminating plant stand counts, right? So who here has done plant stand counts before? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah. Is it just something you just crave and you're just excited to get out there and count all these plants? Not necessarily, right? So it's cool the first few times, but after a while it's pretty monotonous. So first of all, I'll talk about Croptimistic here. Most of you guys, I think, know about it, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. So SWAT Maps is our brand, is our variable rate process. And it was introduced to the market back in 2008 through what you probably know as Crop Pro Consulting. In and around 2018, Croptimistic Technology began its operations and started to offer that same SWAT Maps technology and process to other like agronomy companies globally around the world. We have patented products called SWAT Maps, of course. That's patented process for variable rate. SWAT Water is a soil moisture modeling process, in-season soil moisture modeling process. SWAT Box is our electrical conductivity and elevation mapping system that we've developed that feeds data into SWAT Maps, and SWAT CAM, which we'll talk about today. Head office is in Nacum, Saskatchewan, so in the northeast of Saskatchewan, and our team is dispersed globally, really. Of course, we've built out from Saskatchewan outwards, so we have a presence in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, of course, but an employee out in Atlantic Canada, a few in the U.S., and recently one in Australia as well. In 2018, the focus became scaling SWAT Maps globally, and we'll talk a little about that coming up here as well, and where some of the challenges for that are. And we have about 100 SWAT Map service providers spread around the world. So a lot of them, of course, are in Western Canada, into the northern plains of the U.S., central U.S., Midwest, down into southern U.S., South Africa as well, and some in Australia. So, and growing in all of those areas. And of course, Eastern Canada and Atlantic Canada as well. This is just a picture of the founders as well as some of our investors. So some of you probably know Corey Wellness, that's his wife Shannon, and Derek Massey, so that's the owners of the company. So when we talk about our technology, we talk about it as an ecosystem. And so SWAT Maps, I'll explain more what that is coming up here. That's our foundation. Everything we do surrounds SWAT Maps. It's based on SWAT Maps. SWAT Records, that's our software platform. All the data, of course, is housed there. That's where the analytics happen. That's where our farmers and our agronomy partners interact with the data. SWAT Box, so this is data feeding into SWAT Records. So we map fields for electrical conductivity and elevation. That feeds directly into SWAT Records with that tool. SWAT CAM, of course, is another tool that we use to collect field in the data. Data in the field. And SWAT Water, that's the soil moisture modeling program that we use. So we collect in situ soil moisture probe data and feed that into our SWAT Maps foundation, and then we model the soil moisture across the field. And we have various SWAT APIs with other software from other companies. So before we get started into SWAT CAM here, I need to educate you guys on SWAT Maps a little bit here. So SWAT stands for soil, water, and topography. And this is what we use to zone fields. So when we talk about soil, we're talking about factors such as soil texture, soil organic matter, topsoil depth, salinity, if you have that in your fields. And all of these impact fertilizer and yield responsiveness. Water, of course, in our opinion, has the most profound influence on yield and fertilizer response, especially if you have a lot of topography. And we want to delineate dry versus wet areas of the field for zone management purposes. And topography. So this is related to water and soil, but it describes the landscape position, of course. Is it a water shedding area? Is it a water collecting area? And so on. And this influences things like moisture, of course, erosion, organic matter levels, pH, and fertility levels. So we zone fields into 10 zones. And In general, this is how fields are zoned. If we were to explain each one of these zones, okay, so red being zone 1s, the other extreme, zone 10 being the dark greens. Okay, so zone 1 and 2, these are the highest and driest parts of the field. Okay, they're eroded knolls, hills, could be sandy, typically low organic matter areas, the driest areas of the field. Zone 3 and 4, we're starting to move down the slope a little bit. Water's running off. Zone 5 and 6, this is typically your field average areas. Typically where you grow your best crops year in and year out because they're not the first to dry out and they're not the first to flood either. Zone 7 and 8, we're starting to get a little wetter. We're down into the toe slopes, lower flats. And zone 9 and 10s, these are the wettest parts of the field. They could be saline, typically, or heavier clay water collection areas. Could be peaty, typically higher organic matter, just wet. So that's the extremes of our SWAT zones. So I'm going to do a little bit of a test here now. Okay, so, sorry, I didn't get your name. Andrew? Knowing what I just told you, I'm going to see if you're paying attention. Where would zone 1 be in this field here? Okay, so in and around this area? Whoops. That isn't. Nope. Correct. Prize for you. Good catch. Okay. I didn't get your name, sorry? Kelly? Oh, I know you, Kelly. Sorry. Where would zone 10 be? Correct. Yes. You have a SWAT map sat, yeah? There you go. Okay. Zone 5, you know, in the middle, field average area, kind of on the edge of where the moisture is just starting to show there. And you know, there's the rest of the zones. Okay. So now we have you educated on SWAT maps. Now we can talk more so about the process. Okay, so to create the zone map, we collect electrical conductivity, elevation data, that's the base layers, and we turn that into other layers, such as water flow, organic matter, and topography layer, and it's a merging of various layers to create a zone map. And we don't just create one zone map and be done with it, it's create a bunch of layers, a bunch of zone maps, and then it's needing to be ground truthed. Okay, so in this particular field, we got an eroded knoll here. You can see it's showing up in the stubble. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have areas of salinity along this creek here. Okay? And I will point out that these areas could yield similarly, right? Maybe on the edge of this salinity here, could yield quite similarly to there, but for very different reasons. Okay, so this is why we zone fields the way we do. So ground truthing, a critical part of the process. Soil sampling, so then we soil sample by zone, just traditional soil sampling. Then we create a prescription. Okay, so in this case, we've got a 4-tank air seeder that we're putting down some NH3, canola, phos, and sulfur, different rates for different zones.
Talking about our support for the.
So another part of the process, so the crop has been seeded, it's coming up. We want to see how we did. How well did we establish that crop? So we go out, we send agronomists out to the field for doing plant stand counts, doing an assessment of how well that crop is established. And how we do that now is we just take our phones out there and we go, we know where we are on the map, take pictures of this zone, count with a tape measure or a metered out stick, count how many plants there are, enter that into our app. Okay? So I mentioned earlier that we're trying to scale this process, right? We're trying to scale this globally. So do you see a bit of a problem here? Okay, so if you think about, let's say, a large farm that maybe has 50 fields like this, right? Can you think about how much time that requires, how much effort that is, how monotonous that is for the person doing that? Okay, so it's really valuable information. Like we would love to see this in every field, but in reality, practical purposes here, we can only really, see maybe 10 to 20% of the farm, right? It's just, it would take forever. And plus, the time frame to do this is really narrow, right? The optimal time frame, okay? Then we also go out pre-harvest and see, how's that crop looking? How even is it? What's the maturity look like? Was there any disease problems? Those sort of things. Okay, so it's another check on the variable rate strategy that was employed to see how we're doing right before harvest. So we have a problem, right? We've got this part of the process that we really like the data, right? We really want to know this information, but it's slow, right? It's laborious. You don't really require a lot of skill to throw a stick down and count plants, okay, and enter this into the app. Okay, it's compressed into a small window, as I mentioned. Low resolution, right? So we're really only sampling, let's say, 5 to 10 areas of a field. So there's no way we're getting to every corner of a field. There's no way we're getting to every field. Okay? We'll choose, let's say, a couple wheat fields, a couple canola fields, maybe a couple pulse crops to check on a farm. That's the best we can do with the labor resources that are there. Okay? It's subjective. So if you go out to a field and let's say you're the one that created the prescriptions for that field. You want yourself to look good. You want that result to be good. Okay. Are you likely to go to a really poor zone 10 that's flooded out and say, here's your plant stand count? All right. So there's that kind of bias built into the process. Okay. And of course, we're driving around like Western Canada is, you guys all know, it's way spread out, right? To get to all these fields, especially some of these larger farms that are spread out, maybe 50, 60 miles from one corner of the farm to the other, right? We're traveling tremendous distances to gather this low resolution data. It's really important data, but we're spending a lot of money, a lot of labor resources to get this data. Okay? And we're not finding all these problem areas, and we're not finding all the good areas either, right? You pretty much arbitrarily pick a field to go check every year. And you might switch that field up every year, right? But we're not necessarily finding those problems, those corner conditions, if you will, for each one of our fields and in each one of these zones. So you guys have seen the process, of course, throwing the hula hoop. We've got a tape measure here where we're counting plants within a certain distance, right? So that's the kind of standard that we have right now.
So it's usually from 1 to 9. What came from
SWAT CAM. So how can we do this better, right? How can we make this process more efficient? How can we collect better data? Okay, so in our opinion, a sprayer is the ultimate vehicle to collect this sort of data. Okay, so it's going across most acres of the farm multiple times throughout the year. Typically, it's going over the field at the time frame we want to be counting these plants and evaluating the establishment of the crops. Okay, it's unbiased. We're just capturing images as we go through the field. Okay, it's not being selective of which areas it's picking images from. It's just automated image capture. No additional labor. Okay, so you put this on, the camera's on, beginning of the year on the sprayer booms. It's all automated. You give it power and it does its thing. Okay, the data automatically uploads, the data processing happens automatically, and the presentation of the data back to the farmer, back to the agronomist also happens automatically. Okay, so some people will say, why don't you just use drones, right? Drones can go over your fields, capture these images, yeah. But we're not there yet where we have these swarms of drones that can work out of sight, right? The rules are you have to have it in line of sight. So there's a person, right? That person needs to drive to all of these fields. So it's still a tremendous amount of labor to capture that with drones. Okay? So everybody throws out the thing, use drones for everything. Okay, well there's still that manual labor component to it.
That we have in order to make informed decisions in real.
So we're able to capture the whole farm. So now we can,
access to
the way we process the data and how we present it to the agronomist and farmer is we can identify some of the problem areas. Right now we haven't missed a little corner of a field, or we haven't missed this zone that's performing poorly. Okay, so we're able to show the good areas, right? And we're able to show the poor areas as well. Okay? Because a farmer or agronomist doesn't have the time to look through this data of 20 to 50 fields, right? They don't want to just have to page through more information. Okay, so we want to create this process, or we want to make this process way more efficient, right? So in 2 years, we don't want to be doing this manual plant stand counts anymore. Okay? So the demand for SWAT maps is increasing, And
the training
part of
data
that,
sets that they need to be able to
of
optimize
the
their,
limitation
you know,
to
vision.
scaling that is this part of the process. Okay, so we had to create a tool to make that more efficient. So how do we install this? Just on the sprayer booms. Okay, so you can see it here, and we put a camera on each boom. Okay, so if this was a 120-foot sprayer, you got about 60-foot resolution.
Support the development
And we
of on-site
take the camera,
specific
capture every 60 feet.
to be able
There's
to
an app
reduce risk
that controls
and
the
shock
camera that captures every 60
farmers.
feet.
So
There you
Kane
can see
is
it there. There's actually a little light underneath here as well to help us capture better quality images at dawn and dusk. In the in the dead of the evening, when it's really, really dark,
is, a project that is being
I wouldn't
carried
say our image quality is as good as daylight, of course, right? It's really hard to replicate sunlight, but we can still capture images in the evening.
yesterday. Yeah, so
It's about an hour and a half to install in a sprayer, so you have to run the cabling, and we get power from the sprayer, of course, to power the unit.
so Croptimistic Technology.
So how does it work?
Canadian active company.
Automated camera on
and
each sprayer
they
boom.
have assembled an
Okay,
partnership
just
to
like this
achieve
unit
their
here.
project
Every
goal.
50 to 70
And the
feet,
initiative will see
we can set that distance that we
Farm
capture it
research
at. We're
industry
capturing an image
players
with each
and
camera.
smart
Okay, so it's
staff
about 17 to 20
collaborate to
images per
develop,
acre would be the resolution.
new soil innovation.
And we have
So
machine learning models. So we've worked with the
that,
University of Regina on this. A
farmers
really
spend a lot of
impressive
their
team
budget
there
on
that they have in their
inputs
electronic
into
systems
their
engineering
farms.
department,
Think about
where
safety,
we've developed
think
14
about
different
apply,
crop models
think about
and
um,
3 different weed models.
in view of this, they need
All right.
to be able to.
It's important to point out that everybody gets excited about imaging crop and stuff like that, and they think about the weeds first, but it's important to note that we're more focused on the crop. How well did we establish the crop?
So
We can
SMART-
calculate
the
what the
SWAT
weeds
maps
are, right? Because
are
everything other than
very
crop, we're
taken
considering a
into
weed.
light, and it's
Okay,
being-
but it's not.
but this
Everybody will ask,
project
well, can you
we
detect
see
this
it's
weed or
being
that weed?
expanded
Well, we
to
can,
the
but you'd have to
where it's
develop a
being,
specific model for that weed. Okay?
which
and
crop is
So we
best
have developed some weed models, and we'll talk about that coming up. But it's not as if we're
in
targeting,
what area,
identifying
which
all
crop
these
is
weeds,
best to
right?
go
So
in
what
selling
the
area.
some of the
And
sprayer manufacturers are developing is fantastic with the
I'm going
see and spray technology. That's what they're doing, right? That's a
root
huge task to develop models to
map
identify
weed pressure
every
up
one of these
an
different types
entire
of weeds.
farm
Okay?
and be
So
able to
we're
support
focused on the crop.
prescription.
So we auto-generate these
And
crop and
they
weed
is
maps
funded
okay,
this
based
project
on
to the tune
the
of
results,
1.1
right? So this is a prediction
dollars.
of this wheat crop using the machine learning model for an individual image.
Um,
Here is
one-
thousands
we
of
need
images. I
that
think this was
we
about,
use
this was
to cultivate,
110 acres, and there was about
research
1,200 images here. Each one of those dots is an image,
So
and then we can create a
this,
map of
project
that,
is
right?
the
So
pan-Canadian
this is just as if we were creating an EC map or an
and
elevation
it's
map,
actually
same sort of
from,
thing.
2020.
And we know which zone each one of these images is in. Okay, you can see the zone map is overlaid over top of the topography, and then we have the image points. So now we can summarize that data
Share, data
by
and
SWAT zone. And that's really where the real value of it is, because if we just had, whoops, right? If we just had a flat field here, a flat map, okay, without any connection to
Identify
the
most
water
effective.
properties or the soil properties of the field, yeah, it's good information, but we're going to have a tough
maintain,
time
we
telling
bring,
why, okay? Now we have a foundation, the SWAT zones, to really help us explain, well, why are we establishing poor in some of these areas, right? So the lighter
So
colors
in
here
it-
would be less crop, okay? These darker areas here,
Lakeland College.
why do you
and
think on the edge of the
Saskatchewan
field here we see some of these darker areas, Bryden?
recently added
Partly down here, yeah. Yes, overlap, right? Just little corners of the drill
more
overlap. Yeah.
collaboration and can
What you see here,
competition.
that's counting number of pixels that are identified as
So,
wheat. So if we got
where
50,000 pixels in here,
is increasing
and
globally.
maybe there's 10,000
cattle
pixels that are wheat.
producers are moving towards
So,
increasing their head
and then
size.
the scale
Now, when
here
this
is just a
happens,
percentage,
they-
right?
the time that they
1.3%
have
in the
to
light areas to
individually monitor
69%
animal or
in
even monitor
the
their,
areas.
uh,
So we're not
resources, especially
detecting a level of greenness. It's just is there crop or not.
not just in Canada,
And we're going to
but
get to the plant stamp count portion here.
pretty much everywhere.
So this is the interface within SWAT Records. This is the
This is,
desktop portion of it. There's a mobile version as well that's similar.
Technology in the form
And
of
this is that same field.
to be able to
Okay, you see that prediction here.
use and
And this is the machine learning
run
model
data
that that was run. So we call this a narrow leaf machine learning model. Okay, and we can click through. You know, we're working on things like identifying broadleaf weeds within this grassy crop. We have a kochia model as well. So this is where we can kind of check our predictions to see how accurate they are. Okay? And eventually what we'll have is just kind of a flag or flag for training. If we see some images that aren't predicting well, right, and this happens, right, so it's a lot of work to develop these models, a lot of hours, and there's many different stages, of course, of crops, and even if a crop is stressed versus healthy, it's going to look different, right? And so we have to train the models to still identify it at those different stages and those different health realms. So again, I'll stress the real value here is that linking to the SWAT zones, the SWAT foundation. So in this particular field, this is 2001, right? So these are the sprayer passes here for that year. This is actually our research field by NACM. And the trend here, so this is the whole field, average 29%. Okay, zone ones, this particular field, there's some hills that we're not necessarily showing in here, but it's a little lighter, okay, a little bit gravelly on top of those hills, so we're not establishing quite as well there. We established pretty well here through all of these zones, and in 2021, of course, it was a drier year, okay, so the best established areas were those wetter areas. And this field drains really well, so it's not as if we have a bunch of water sitting around flooding it out at any point. So we can overlay any of the map layers we have over this topography of this field, and then we can look at those, each one of those images right in the pane here. Okay? So it's a good tool to connect the data in the maps to an actual visual observation. So this is a machine learning example how it works. Okay, so this is actually out at the Ag and Motion site at the Discovery Farm. This field here. So this is June 16th. Okay, kind of an optimal timing to do plant stand counts. This is the crop map, and this was anything that wasn't identified as crop was considered weeds. Okay, so these are actually areas of kochia. So they have some salinity out in this particular field. So if we look at zone 1 here. This particular image, we got 32% wheat, we got no weeds. Zone 5, okay, you can see there's a broadleaf here, dandelion, another broadleaf here. Okay, we've got 26% wheat, 3% broadleaf in that particular image. Zone 10, I mentioned salinity. Okay, kochia loves salinity, of course. 14% wheat, 12% of that was kochia. And here's the trend by SWAT zone. So we actually established very well in zone 1s here, all the way through zone 6, and the salinity creeps all the way from zone 7s through 10 here, so you can start to see the effect of that, and the trend of the weeds here, of course, picking up. And majority of those weeds in these, especially zones 8 through 10, it was kochia.
Canada is a very big.
So that's just an example of how we can apply this data and how we can view this data. So I like to do a bit of a test in any sort of new products that we're developing. I like to say, okay, what sort of use cases do we have out there, right? Because there's a lot of products, of course, out there that it's really cool information, but how do I use that? How do I apply that? So we're going to go through a bunch of examples here on some use cases. So the main purpose of this is to evaluate how are we establishing the crop, our variable rate strategy, our prescriptions. How did we do, right? Do we want to make any adjustments? So this particular field here, again, I'm going to look at what we call the statistics window here. How are we doing by zone? Okay, and if I look across from zone 1 all the way through to zone 9, quite consistent. Okay. Now we can also look at the variability, right? So this is a coefficient of variation with each one of those zones, and we give it a rating, okay, just to easily pick out where the areas are that maybe are high variability. So we've got low variability within zones. We've got low variability across zones. Okay, this is one of the targets of SWAT maps, right? We want to try and even out the crops as best we can. We want to achieve plant stand counts, recommended plant stand counts, as close as we can. It's not going to be perfect in each one of the SWAT zones. Okay. Of course, zone 10, okay, low-lying areas here. There's actually some salinity in this field as well. Okay, we're not establishing as well. So if we look at some example images, okay, and it's kind of tough to see the soil, but Zone 1 here, when I look at this, you'll see some rocks here and there. The soil is lighter color, okay? It's dry, okay? It's lowest organic matter. So keep in mind, we have the soil sample results for this field as well, right? So we can say, help explain why we're seeing what we're seeing, okay? So not established as well, obviously, as Zone 6. This is thriving, okay? It's a sandy, loam, well-drained soil, kind of. If this was all of our fields, right, we wouldn't need variable rate, okay? But look at the different extremes, okay? So this is Zone 10. It's crusted, right? It's lumpy, saline soil, okay? Down around this slough would be Zone 10, okay? Not establishing as well. Now back to my explanation of SWAT maps, okay? Would we fertilize this the same as that, right? They're struggling a little bit for very different reasons, okay? So what we've done here is we've reinforced what we're doing. Okay, so this particular field, he drastically cut back the urea in Zone 10. Okay, adding more fertilizer isn't going to make this better. Okay, and knowing where this is at, this was in western Saskatchewan, drier area. Okay, in some areas we may get aggressive in Zone 1s, right? They need fertilizer, but then you're going to need rain, of course, right? But knowing this particular agronomist, they probably backed off a little bit in Zone 1, knowing that that's a higher risk area. Okay, Zone 6, they probably remain very aggressive. So that's just an example of how we would use this to evaluate what we're doing for fertility and seed recommendations. This one was VR, yeah. It's never going to be perfect. Okay, so this field here has pretty extreme salinity along there, right? And you see how rocky and eroded the tops of the hills are, okay? So it would be way worse than a non-variable rate application, in our opinion, of course. Right. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, good question. So, Bryden, what would your approach be? This is your area here, okay? So knowing that this is a dry, rocky area, some knolls up there, would you attempt to increase the seeding rate to establish a better stand there, or not necessarily?
Yeah, I'm actually, like, on the seeding rate stuff, I don't have any answers. We're running a pilot trial.
Okay.
Trying to, yeah, my gut says in drier years, I think I want a few less plants on that knoll.
Okay, yep.
But you could convince me the other way too, so yeah, I see merits.
So this is typically a drier region, right? So in the northeast of Saskatchewan, where we're typically wetter, okay, the strategy might be, okay, maybe we'll increase the seeding rate in Zone 10 and Zone 1. Now, of course, if it's extremely saline in Zone 10, it probably shouldn't be farmed anyway, right? You're not going to establish anything better, but if it's mild salinity, we may increase the seeding rate there to improve our plant stands and consume some of that extra moisture and salts. So it depends on the region, depends on the crop, right? So soybean and corn, they'll probably have different strategies in the U.S. for that as well. Good question. Okay, so just continuing on, evaluating the strategies here. Okay, so this is two different regions again. This is around the Edmonton area, okay, typically wetter, right? And you can see this is our Zone 10 area. Okay, pretty obvious to see that this is flooded out. The plants are looking sick. They're all, yellowing. Okay, and I wish you could see this here, but the trend here is on tops of the hills. That's where we establish the best in this particular field. Okay, the lower areas, that's where they're struggling. Okay, but it's still, we don't want to see these flooded out areas, but it's reality. Okay, but the win here is the N was decreased 60% from Zone 1 to 10. Okay, so if we, of course, just blanket rated this, okay, and water was just the overriding factor here. Too much water, of course, flooded it out. Okay. Moving to west central Saskatchewan, near Bryden's area. Okay, typically a drier area. We got a kind of a gravelly hills here. We've established best in the low areas where it's wetter. Okay, this was early on this year. Okay, and I don't know the particular prescription on this field here, but I'm willing to bet that they weren't that aggressive on top of the hills. Okay, with fertilizer. So you can see how patchy this is here, right? Okay, it's drier, rocky, just a poorer soil structure. So again, very different reasons for establishing poor, right? But at least we have that captured, and the strategy to address that, it was basically, let's farm this the way it is, or farm it the way what the soil is and what the water regime is. Okay? There wasn't an easy fix for these areas. Okay, plant stand counts. This is what we're working on now. So to this point, we've done leaf area, okay, which is still very meaningful, but we really want to get to plant stand counts, right? Because this is what we're trying to automate. So we want to identify the areas that aren't meeting plant stand counts. So this is an example image here, and we've identified, this is corn. Okay, we've identified each corn plant. We started with corn because it's a little easier, because it's spread apart a little bit more than some of our other crops. Notice there's a weed here, of course, that we didn't identify as corn. We've identified each row, and we've measured between each one of these plants. Okay, so we know that these are 30-inch rows. It's corn. Okay, that's how we apply our scale. Okay, so we know how many pixels this image is. We know this distance. We identify the rows, and now we have a scale for that image. Now we can measure between the plants. So when we do the plant stand count here, we can count for every row. So in this case, we're going to have 30 plants, and then we'll have the total row distance, and then we can measure the amount of plants per foot. And of course, it's 30-inch rows, so then we can convert that into plants per square foot. Or in case of corn, they'll want to know plants per acre. Okay, so lots of information there that we can work with. We can also look at things like what's the minimum plant spacing and what's the max plant spacing. So notice here, 12-inch, right? So the target here is 6-inch spacing, right? So this is what they would call a skip in corn, right? The planter skip that maybe it did plant it, but it didn't germinate. Not quite sure. We'd have to go dig that up, but so we were able to identify doubles, right? Those are the ones that are really close together, and we're able to identify skips in corn. So our American partners are really excited about this. This is inches, yeah. So we've converted to. Yeah. So good question. So typically it's 3 to 6 feet, and of course the booms will go up and down. But because we know the row spacing that it was planted at, and we can measure the number of pixels between the rows, now we can create a scale for each one of the images. Okay, so the scale will change, which is fine, but we need to convert that to an actual measurement on the ground. Okay. Good point. Yeah. We've thought of that. That would be a challenge. We could probably apply an average scale. It wouldn't be as accurate as doing it this way. But yeah, how often does that happen in your area? Yeah, mainly it might happen in the Northeast when it's really wet or something, right? They might put it on with a Valmar or something, but it's not a really standard practice. But yeah, good question. But typically, yeah, in our area we're using 10 or 12-inch spacing. So. And we'll know that, right? So we'll have that entered into SWAT records. We just pull that row spacing out based on each field. When you do that?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Well, guide
Good question.
you.
We'll have to think about that one a bit. That'd be a challenge.
Guide you. Not with the word. Yeah, it's always good to have an academic partner on board your project application.
Yeah. So this is what we call an easier one, right? An easier one to predict. Yeah. So and that's where just the training comes in, right? You got to throw as many conditions at it as you can, and as we identify some of these odd conditions of, there's a bunch of weeds, for example, that kind of overlap some of the corn. Those are really challenging images to do predictions on. You just have to continue to retrain your models. So it's a long process. I'm not sure if you're involved in that or not, but to do the training here, they're actually tracing each one of these little plants, right? They might take 50 images and they'll trace around this plant and say this is wheat or this is canola or whatever. Yeah. Yeah, another big challenge. I'd say that's our next stage. So yes, if this were wheat, okay, we can, because we've identified the rows, okay, we can say anything within the row, that's crop, okay? Anything outside of here, that's considered a weed. So even if it was a wild oat that looks similar to wheat, we'd categorize it as a weed, for example. So we haven't got to those details yet, but that would be our approach in that case. Yeah. So does that answer your question somewhat? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so keep in mind, we're trying to do this really economically, and so like we're just using an Android phone to capture this, right? So it's a low cost piece of hardware, easy to get, right? So yeah, we've thought of that, but we're just trying to keep this like a low cost, simple system at this point, low cost data acquisition. So when we're evaluating these strategies, we were able to create a report for every field. Okay, so this is kind of early versions of the report, but we're able to pick out an example image of each one of these zones, a representative image, and then there's a bunch of data in this table. We're going to turn that more into graphs, just because graphs are just easier to digest very quickly, right? So you can see the crop and the weeds by SWAT zone here, right? This is how we're going to present the data, and then we're going to be able to make this such that we can sort it by the best and the worst, right? We want to be able to say, okay, your canola, let's find the worst established zones, the worst field, just be able to make that selectable, because of course we don't want an agronomist or farmer having to page through 50 fields to find what they want, 50 reports. So the data is really important, but how the data is available to the end customer is just as important. So don't look at these other images yet, just look at this. Okay, just look at this for now. This is June 15th. This is satellite NDVI. You know, everybody's looked at this. And I should have put this in 2D, but this is oats. Okay. Daryl, where would you say the oats have established best? So this is high NDVI, brown is low NDVI. Where are the oats establishing the best? Well, knowing, of course, like it's more crop in the blue areas, less crop in the brown areas. Blue areas, right? Yeah, easy answer. Okay. So, do we know why at this point? Do you know why it's established the way it is? Do we know why it's doing better in these areas? We have a little better idea because I've overlaid this over 3D right now. Okay, but typically we're looking at this in 2D. Okay, it's just a picture. Okay, good information, right? But we're lacking some information to know why. Okay. This is a little check we do actually sometimes. So this is the map that's created from the SWAT CAM data, right? And keep in mind, we've captured this every 50 or 60 feet, right? It's not capturing every square inch of the field. Okay, this would be 10-meter satellite resolution. Okay, and what we sometimes look at is how close is this to the satellite image. Okay, just as a check to see how well are we doing our predictions. Okay, in this case, it matches pretty closely, right? Okay, so if I look at the correlation, it's actually about 0.8, okay, which in GIS terms is pretty strong, okay, pretty strong correlation. So we're happy to see that. Okay, this is only 4 days apart, so it's going to be pretty similar. Crop hasn't advanced too much further. Okay, so keep in mind what Daryl said. Okay, these are the best oats. The oats are doing really well here, right? Okay, well, now we do the machine learning. Okay, we've separated out the crop and the weeds. Now what do we see? Where's the best areas of where's the oats doing the best? Okay, dark is higher crop areas, lighter is the poorer areas. Okay? Less crop there. Okay, so in this case, actually the weeds were correlating more strongly to the NDVI map than the crop. Okay? So again, keep in mind, this is early stages before the weeds have been sprayed out, right? If we looked at this into July when the weeds are sprayed out, okay, it would be more indicative of the crop, okay? But everybody looks at a satellite image in 2D and thinks, oh yeah, my crop's doing well over here and it's not doing well over there, but you don't really know that it's crop yet, okay? And this isn't the case in all fields, right? This is a really weedy field, okay? Like you don't want to see fields like this. Yeah. 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 And not every field is like this, but we have seen some pretty good, strong examples like this of, oh, well, if I were just looking at this, and let's say we're going to do a top grass or something like that, and you're going to use this, right? You're fertilizing more weeds than crop. Okay, so we found this really interesting. So this is a prediction. This is an example right in that area there, right? That looks like it's doing well. Okay, it's actually 28% crop and 27% weeds, half and half. Okay. And the correlation there is about 0.55 from the weeds to the satellite, and to the oats it's 1.3. Okay, so this is actually telling us more about weeds than crop. Pretty interesting slide. Another use case, so in our research field that Corey Wellness played with here this past year, it was in intercropping trials, and we were able to moderately successful. This is really tough when you have 3 different crops to identify each individual crop within the same field. But we were able to identify the canola independent of the lentil and peas, and so on. Lentils independent of everything else. And then because all of these crops are not what we consider a grassy crop, we can say everything that's a grassy plant is a weed. Okay? So then we're able to do a grassy weeds map as well. So intercropping, of course, isn't overly common yet, but this is another potential use case for us down the road. This is another interesting one that we applied this fall. So I mentioned we have a kochia model. And what we did, of course, is this was in June when this was captured, okay, when the kochia was thriving. Okay, there's lots of salinity in this field. And this is an example image from Zone 8. 20% kochia. That's a prediction of that kochia there. So we're doing pretty good. Okay. Only 25%, sorry, yeah, 20% canola, 25% kochia in that particular field. Here's the trend by SWAT zone. Okay. So knowing what you guys know, sorry, I got to speed it up. Okay. Right. So these are our saline zones, and what we did is we actually took, we said, okay, zone 8s to 10s.
Right.
These are where most of our kochia is. Let's apply our edge at $30 an acre, okay, in those areas, plus some of these other zones where we've identified kochia. Okay, so this particular customer sprayed 1,300 acres of this, not sprayed, applied, sorry, and 14% of the area was actually treated. Another one here, on-off fungicide. So lots of times I hear about, okay, we can't get satellite imagery because it's cloudy or it's smoky or whatever the case may be. Okay, so we've got a zone 1 example here, 41%, zone 5, and zone 10. Okay, do we need to apply fungicide here? Not at all. Okay, so shut it off in zone 10, 7.4% in that case. So just another example of a use case. Trials comparisons. This was an inadvertent trial, but he used a different seed lot for his peas here that were untreated, and they were way behind. They didn't establish as well as the rest of the field here. I haven't seen the yield map for this yet. I'll be really interested to see that.
That's right.
This was based on SWAT CAM data. Yeah, yeah. So this is a prediction of one of the areas. That's peas. So it's 30% lower. If you were to see the graph here, 30% lower in that strip. So of course it was seeded this way and sprayed this way.
Right. That is the kind of project that
Research plot. So this is an example of about 90 seeding rate trials and fertilizer placement trials. Okay, this is another, I guess, application where we see this could be of value. It took this company about a week with 2 people doing the counts and evaluations of these different trials. Okay, so these are a whole bunch of little small trials and strips. Okay, so you can see the differences. So another potential application. Pre-harvest crop maturity. Okay, so this is lentils in your area, Bryden, and we can see the lentils, of course, establishing very well in the low wet. Sorry, it's still green, I should say, in the low wet areas. Okay, versus the tops of the hills are all matured out. Okay, we don't want to see this, but can we do better? Can we make an adjustment such that this difference isn't so great? Okay, it's a challenge in lentils, I'm guessing. Yeah. 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 Same thing in peas here. Okay, so we had different variety here. So we can see the strip that's more mature, maturing earlier. Okay, so this is showing up in our data when he went and did his desiccation. So we can challenge existing practices. So of course, when farmers are spraying in the fall, doing a blanket application across a field. In this case, most of the weeds were all on the borders. Okay, and it's just to kind of get you thinking, can we be more strategic about this? Okay, so of course it'd be awesome if we had this before we went and sprayed, right? And maybe down the road, when drones become swarming and automatic, maybe we can use this technology to go ahead of our sprays, right? And do this. That's coming eventually. But this is just showing. This is actually an area right in this area here. So there's definitely weeds there, but most of this field there's no weeds. And on that same topic, okay, I mentioned some of this see and spray technology, which is fantastic stuff. So the green on brown is here. That works well. The green on green has got a lot of work to do yet. But this is an example of, if you were to, there's maybe only 5% of this field where there was actually weeds, right? So you're going to have a huge payoff on a see and spray technology there. Now the use case, so we're looking at these images as if, okay, what else can we extract from it? Right? We look at all the plant counts and the plant leaf area and weeds and stuff like that. What other useful information is in each one of these images? And one of the things that we're looking at is what can we learn about the soil, actually? So again, this is just the surface, but we can learn things from the soil. And what we have to do then is we need to eliminate everything else. When we're developing the machine learning models, we need to just identify the soil pixels, okay? And when we do this, we can actually say, okay, 30% of this image is actually soil. So 30% is bare soil, and we can map that. And we can map also the residue cover and the vegetation separately. So we can say, okay, we established poorly over here, our crop, and our residue cover was really high in those areas, right? We didn't do a good job of managing the residue because our chopper was poor, or we didn't do a good job with the harrows or something like that, right? So just another interesting layer to correlate to things like yield or crop establishment. And the last one here, so some of you know Wes Anderson, so he's recently moved to Australia, but he still has customers back in Alberta, right, that he's connected to. He created prescriptions for these guys and did sampling for these guys in the spring. And of course, he's still invested in those guys and wants to see how the crops are doing. So he's in Australia, and he's actually looking at SWAT CAM images from Australia, right? And he found some cleavers, okay? But that was just an example of what he found. But it was really allowed him to still have a connection to those fields and be able to visually see the crop. So he can look in every one of these SWAT zones. How is it doing in our SWAT zone 1s and 10s and so on, right? And with, of course, many of our farms growing and getting bigger and bigger and more spread out, agronomists, I'm sure, have a challenge, right, of covering all of these fields and seeing all these fields. This is just another tool and toolbox to, give you easy access to these, to find out, is there areas that I need to go check out instead of having to try and go to every field. Like, that'd be ideal, but, it's practically sometimes not possible.
Right.
So just another connection from a remote area. So our plan here for 2023, we're going to have SWAT cams on sprayers with our service providers across North America, as well as a few in Australia. So we've got our supported crop and weed leaf area models here. So wheat, barley, oats, our standard cereal crops, canola, peas, potatoes. Actually works really well in potatoes. Corn, soybean, lentil, flax, dry bean, edible bean, and kochia is our weed model. And we can identify grassy weeds in a broadleaf crop. And we're working on identifying broadleaf weeds in a grassy crop. For 2023, you're going to be able to view every image, every 50 to 70 feet within the SWAT Records app, either mobile or desktop. So the crop and weed leaf area is what we can do well now. Okay, and we're working on the plant stand counts. Okay, so beta will be 2023 for the plant stand counts for canola, soybean, and corn. Okay, and we will be working on how can we do it for cereals. It's going to be a huge challenge, but we have a few ideas on how we can do it, but that'll be a little ways off yet. Okay, so the crop and weed maps for every sprayer pass at the early crop stages. So I'd say when it's about 50% vegetation cover and less, we can identify the crops well. That's where our models are trained for, right?
Yeah,
We haven't trained models for like a late stage, because the real value is in those early stages. After that, then it's just vegetation maps. So we're not at that point identifying weeds and crops separately anymore. It's just like an NDVI map, or similar to an NDVI map at that point, because we're still going across. We're not turning this off at any point. It's still capturing images. So we say, well, we might as well, just create a vegetation map for it and see how it's doing.